Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar brought to you from the Smith School of Business at Queen's University. My name is Elspeth Murray, and I'm the director for our Center for Entrepreneurship, Innovation, and Social Impact, and I am also the academic director for the Master of Management of Innovation and Entrepreneurship, a Smith Innovation Suite program, and I will be your host for today's event. Before going too much further and recognizing the glorious fall day it is here in Kingston, I would like to acknowledge that Queens is situated on the traditional Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee territory. We are very grateful to be able to live, learn, and play on these lands. I'm very pleased to welcome you to this webinar, Built to Innovate, a timely program if there ever was one. And over the next hour, we're going to discuss a number of things related to how you can create an organization that is built to innovate. Before we dive into the meat of today's webinar, I have a few housekeeping issues that I wanted to go over. First of all, we're recording this presentation, and just by being registered today, you'll automatically receive a link to the recording into your inbox in the coming days, and feel free to share the link with whoever you think might be able to benefit from the webinar and who might have been unable to attend today. The chat feature, which we're also familiar with today, will be open so you can converse with one another here today. We'd love to know where everyone is tuning in from. As I said, it's a beautiful fall day, and I am sitting in my office here in Kingston, Ontario. The Q&A button, which you'll note at the bottom of your screen, will be the way in which you submit questions, and we will make sure that we have time at the end of the webinar to take your questions. And yes, we do take questions and would be more than happy to answer those. So please don't put anything into the chat feature because we might miss those. The Q&A button is the way to go. Now it is my great pleasure to introduce my colleague and today's co-presenter, Dr. Kathryn Brohman. And I think Kathryn's going to, there she is. We love the opportunity to work together. Kathryn is the program director for our Master of Digital Product Management, a program also in Smith's Innovation Suite. She is an incredible academic and practitioner, and she holds the E. Marie Shantz Fellow of Digital Technology at Smith. She's an author, an expert on digital transformation and strategy execution. And welcome, Kathryn. I am really looking forward to our conversation today.
All right, well, thanks, Elspeth, and it's nice to be here for sure. I'm coming in from Waterloo, Ontario, so I see in the chat there's people that are in my neck of the woods, but I look forward to today's conversation.
Okay. All right, before we dive into the meat of today's content, some of you may be wondering what Smith's Innovation Suite of programs actually is. We have two programs that are part of this Innovation Suite. Kathryn and I are the academic leads for these two programs. So the Master of Digital Product Management and the Master of Management, Innovation, and Entrepreneurship. They each have their own focus, but what's really wonderful about the Innovation Suite is that we connect students in each of those programs through applied projects, shared learning experiences, opportunities, many opportunities to collaborate. And ultimately together, they help professionals on these programs create solutions, lead change, drive innovation, and generally take the lead in all things new in their organizations. We're going to show you a slide in just a moment, and here it is with two QR codes that describe, if you click on those, which describe the differences between the two programs. Kathryn, maybe you can talk about what we affectionately refer to as MDPM, and I'll explain a little bit about the MMIE program, but the gory details are available through those QR codes. So Kathryn, over to you.
Sure, thanks. So MDPM was started, we're just recruiting into our fourth cohort. So it's the newest of our suite of, our newest program in the suite of programs here at Smith. It evolved from practices out of Silicon Valley. So as like an old kind of IT project management morphed into this product management practice. So we take the innovation concepts that are early stage around, identifying your problem, and then we parlay that into a partner program with the School of Computing, who really help us to understand how you build products in today's day of, blockchain and artificial intelligence, and how those products really continue to live. So gone are the days of packaging something on a CD and sending it out, or, and here today are living products that can change weekly. So we teach you how to build those, how to adapt, how to make sure that they market well, make sure that we manage the change internally. So it's a full life cycle program, all the way from the beginning of ideation, all the way to scaling of the product. And so it is in partnership again with the School of Computing. And to Elspeth's point, you can get more information on that QR code.
Or by going to the school's website, or Googling either one of those programs or searching for those, and you will see the different structures and how they relate to one another. Let me talk a little bit about the MMIE program, so the Innovation and Entrepreneurship Program. We are in our 11th year of that program, and that program is really for entrepreneurs who want to build, who want to scale, for corporate innovators who are looking to understand how innovation can occur within the confines of an existing enterprise. And it's also a program where we have people who participate in the innovation ecosystem. So accelerators, incubators, we have people from policy shops and government who are on the innovation file. And as with the MDPM program, you can find out more information either by going to the website or with those QR codes. All right, let's get into the meat of the program that we have put together for you today. And I'm going to share my slide here, and Kathryn and I are going to do a bit of a tag team. We've already briefly introduced ourselves, and I'm going to start off with about 15 minutes or so talking, as we like to say, about how you create an organizational platform to drive innovation. I'll get into some specifics, and Kathryn will get into other specifics, and then we will have time for some Q&A. It may be obvious why so many of you are here on this webinar today, but we live in very interesting times. Some of you may be familiar with the acronym VUCA, which basically says there's a lot in flux in the world today. And as you look at this particular chart, what we've really seen over the last few years is a decreasing longevity of the life cycle of an organization. There are many reasons why we don't have a 61-year run anymore in success in organizations, and that can be attributed to anything from massive geopolitical forces all the way down to some of the extraordinary changes that we've seen in the area of technology. So innovation is a key way to improve the longevity of any organization's lifespan. And what's interesting to both Kathryn and I over the years as we've been teaching and researching in this area is that people throw the term innovation around in a bit of a loosey-goosey fashion. They sometimes confuse it with the inventive act or the ideation phase. But among the many definitions of innovation that you would find through a quick Google search, the key point here is that innovation is ultimately an outcome of taking something, an idea, an invention, and deriving some sort of commercial success or impact from that. Yes, there is an innovation process. And yes, innovation can be big or small, but the key takeaway here is that there is something that comes out of it all at the end. What you see on the screen here is an illustration of various types of innovation in the car industry. And back to the 61-year run, you look at a lot of the auto manufacturers, and they did incremental innovation for a long period of time. A new paint color, changing the headlight design. Then we started to get a bit more sophisticated, and the SUV came along, and then the minivan came along. Now we have electric cars, and now we have hybrid cars, and now we have subscription business models. So the key takeaway here is that Incremental innovation is perfectly okay, but every now and again, you have to do something really big. And we like to think of the small wins as a way to fund investments in really big shifts. As you look at this slide, this is really around product and maybe a bit of service innovation, but the reality is that very innovative organizations, you see innovation occur everywhere. One of my favorite organizations that's done a great job on innovation over many years is a company that is now part of Deloitte called Doblin. And this particular slide just really talks about all of the areas within an organization where innovation can occur. So it's not just products and services, it's ultimately experiences, customer experiences, employee experiences. It can be innovation in the way in which you make money. Lots of companies are trying to figure out what that new financial business model is. But innovation occurs everywhere and can be little and can be small. Here's the kicker. And one of the reasons why Kathryn and I are so excited about our innovation suite of programs, but more importantly about the time that we have with you folks here. It is shocking to both of us that when you look at some of the stats, only 25% of companies are innovation ready. And what does that mean in practice? It means three things, and we're going to dive into a few of these in more detail over the course of the webinar. So first of all, innovation can't just be a tagline in a vision statement or in a set of values. It really means that it is a priority, and that when you actually lift the hood and look at the innovation engine, you see evidence that innovation is a priority for the organization. Number two is that talk is cheap. Following the money, looking at where it's spent, looking at how people are recruited into an organization, those are the things that start to feed into being innovation ready. And not surprisingly, the devil is in the details. So it's great to talk about innovation. It's great to put it in vision statements. It's great to have KPIs around innovation, but there's so much more that happens under the hood of that car. So looking at a bit more detail here and unpacking this a bit, obviously there's a huge component of people that matter. Okay, and in the famous words of a gentleman by the name of William McKnight, who was the CEO of the very impressive and innovative organization called 3M, had a great line, and he said, "Hire smart people and get out of the way." Fortunately, life is a bit more complicated than that. So when we look at innovation ready, we have to look at the organizational platform that's in place. So if we unpack the right-hand side of this just a little bit further, we have elements in this platform that are related to leadership, the degree to which you signal your actual intent around innovation, and of course, culture, which is a huge word, but really informs the way in which people behave day in and day out. Do they come forward with their ideas? Do they collaborate? Do they stick through processes to achieve outcomes? Those are some of the things on the left-hand side of this. And of course, when we talk about getting out of the way of good people, we have to understand what motivates people. So people practices, we have to look at where resources are deployed. And one of the most important things to build an innovation-ready organization is the degree to which the processes, the systems, the policies, all of those things align with the left-hand side of this slide. So one of the ways in which Kathryn and I like to talk about how these two sides of the organizational platform relate is to really look at the ignition system. So yes, we're going to use an analogy of an engine. So the left-hand side really talks about and tells the engine, why and where to go. And the right-hand side really talks about how to prime that engine, how to get ready, how to make sure that all of that intent actually gets translated into execution. So I'm going to focus on the left-hand side. And what I would say, we have just under an hour here to talk about this enormous topic. And our goal here is to whet your appetite for thinking about whether your organization is actually innovation ready. But on both the MMIE program and the MDPM program, we take each one of these elements and we do a deep dive into them. So what you're going to get today is a bit of a quick pass through these items, both the priming of the engine and the engine itself. And hopefully you'll generate a bunch of fabulous questions for us to take a little bit later. So I'm going to talk briefly about three things. I'm going to talk about how you signal and know that there's actual strategic intent around innovation. I will briefly talk about, by way of a fantastic story I hope you'll remember, of the leadership component of this. And then I will talk a little bit about this thing called culture and how you can recognize a culture that is capable of innovation, but also talk a little bit about the elements that actually lead to it. So without strategic intent and a genuine commitment to innovation, having innovation labs, hiring clever, motivated people, those things matter not a whole lot, because the whole point of strategic intent is that you orient an organization to what's important. So for example, as you read through this slide here, once Ford moved beyond being a maker of cars to being in the business of transportation, that unleashed a whole bunch of thinking about new ways of building businesses that were related to transportation. Yes, cars and minivans were involved, but it really created an opportunity to capture ride sharing, subscription services, you name it, in the auto industry. At Google, they get even more specific, and they have something called the 70-20-10 rule, which signals to the organization that 70% of their innovation resources will be focused on ideas that are related to their core business of search. 20% will be allocated to things that are already bubbling and show some traction, and only 10%, even with all of the cash they have, will be allocated to really difficult breakthrough game changer ideas. And you look at yet another industry where they're even more specific. So they want people to think from a customer perspective. They want people to come up with ideas, and this is the migration path point, like 3M has done historically, where there might be an invention that has multiple uses. And I always love this slide when I teach because it looks at the very analog overhead projector that actually morphed into a huge number of new businesses, in some cases, lines of business that 3M took forward over many years. So the key takeaway so far is that at that highest level, there are guardrails that signal to everyone what's in and what's not in with respect to taking ideas and doing something with them. Now we can get more specific. And one of the things that I look for in organizations that are truly innovation ready or want to be innovation ready is the degree to which they measure. And there are two different ways of thinking about these key performance indicators. Many organizations get stuck at the input level, by the way. Okay, they track, the time people spend on generating ideas. They track the dollars allocated to innovation and things like that. That's all well and good. But what about the throughputs and what about the outputs? So Kathryn will talk a little bit about some of the processes. So it's like a giant funnel. Not all ideas can turn into an innovation or an outcome. So how do you think about that throughput? And then ultimately, organizations that are completely dialed into innovation track those outputs and even outcomes. So that's one way of looking for KPIs that might signal that innovation is an actual fact, a strategic imperative. You can also look at different categories related to creating this kind of innovation machine. How much time do leaders spend on the innovation file? How good or how capable are employees at putting things like business plans together or business cases or using tools such as a lean canvas? What kind of climate or culture is there, and how do you sort of measure that? What is the efficiency ratio from ideas that go all the way through to innovations? And what is the balance between kind of that incremental or easy stuff and the more difficult stuff? Um, like most Canadians at this point in time, I'm zeroed in on how the Jays are doing. So you can't only swing for the fences. It's okay to have some singles, some doubles, some triples, and all of those things matter. So that's the whole notion of looking at a balance of where you're spending your resources and what is coming out and when is it coming out. All right. This big thing called culture and leadership. It's interesting to us when we look at these innovation systems that all pieces must be present. You can't just have one or two things. And conversely, if there is one thing that's not working, part of the leadership challenge is to zero in on that and affect the changes. And if you look at perhaps a measure of success being the stock price, you can see that when Satya Nadella, who's the CEO of Microsoft, arrived, beautiful things started to happen. And there is a fabulous book called Hit Reset, which really looks at the story of what Nadella did when he arrived at Microsoft. And it was simple. They had a ton of money, they had smart people, they had technology, they had a whole bunch of other pieces, but they had a brutal HR practice where they fired the quotes the bottom 10% performers every year, and that completely ruined the culture of supportive of innovation, and that's what Nadella sought to fix. Okay, the last thing that I'm going to cover here is this thing called culture. And as you look at this slide, and we spend a lot of time in our programs talking about this, people will say we have to build an innovation culture that, and then everything will work out okay. Not so. When you look at the research that looks at the top performers in innovation, big companies, small companies, those that aren't that great, in particular, regardless of size, innovation leaders are remarkably alike in terms of culture. But where they differ between the leaders and the laggards is a deliberate design of the details of their entire innovation system. And for example, clear prioritization of some of those efforts. So translating that strategic intent into what people actually do on a day in, day out basis. And there was great, you'll see it in just a sec. You can be very deliberate about creating the elements of culture that will create an organization that is capable of innovation, but it's not the only thing. So when the Googles of the world talk about the amazing nature of this primordial ooze or having few structures or processes, what they're really talking about is you don't want needless bureaucracy, but what you need systems and processes that will really facilitate great people, highly motivated people, and an organization that doesn't just get out of their way, but that actually facilitates what is needed on the innovation front. And that's where deliberate design comes in. So my last comment on culture, and I'm happy to take questions on this later, is when you look at both the leaders and the laggards, you see this alignment. You see, freedom to act is sort of, in the right place. They are fast at making decisions. They celebrate calculated risk taking. It's a very collaborative organizations. People build on ideas. They have fun. They work well together. And that was really Nadella's insight at Microsoft, is that if you're going to fire the bottom 10% every year, people are going to play to win individually, not play to win as a collective. And the last element of culture is this celebration of innovators. And there are lots of ways in which you can do that. But culture is a necessary but insufficient condition. For the other pieces, we need a little bit of deliberate design. So, Kathryn, I'm going to pass things along to you and give you a chance to talk about taking the engine and priming it with fuel and other energy.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Elspeth. And I think I'll start exactly where Elspeth left off on the slide on culture, in that I think one of the biggest changes in being built to innovate in today's environment is the concept of being deliberate. So there was a day when, innovation labs were playful. We were, this concept of play and really trying to put, 10% or 20% of your resources into really creating that new thing. Whereas the big shift for me has been around the work I'm doing on digital transformation, which is the idea that innovators need to be much more deliberate about leading the work. So, there was a time again where we would have this concept of saying, okay, well, I'm going to innovate, I'm going to come up with the idea, and then I'm going to pass it over to the people that get it done. Whereas if you take a look at transformative business models and fundamentally changing the way we think about our organization, or fundamentally thinking about changes in the way we work, it comes down to this concept of being much more deliberate in your actions around innovation. And so I call that priming the engine, which is not the engine itself. If you think about priming the engine, all you're trying to do is get the organization set up in a way that you can deliver. And when you think about Elspeth's, comment on the Blue Jays, right? When you think about sports teams, they're very deliberate in priming through practice. So they go on the field, they practice again, they practice again. And organizations, by design, we don't practice well, right? Especially in those the complex work where we're trying to bring people across departments to do something. Oftentimes those feel very new. And so we don't have a way of working to guide our way in innovation, which is very different than operational work, right? Operational work, you get kind of this whole idea of Elspeth and I, we teach our courses, we go about our day job. But when it comes to innovation, fundamentally, we're thinking about doing things differently. And that's why priming the engine is such an important part. So I like to think about it as igniting the engine. Sure, we got to get the strategy, the strategic intent, the leaders in place. And then we think about getting it done, which is driving out the results to make sure that innovation actually delivers on the strategy. However, this is the critical part in the gap in between, right? Closing the strategy execution gap between the strategy and the actual getting it done comes down to really understanding what it means to prime the engine. So I'm going to talk specifically about 4 things. And what I really want to focus on is the blue, because I think the gray ones, we've been thinking about these for a while, but I really think the new part of being designed to innovate, like really ready to innovate in today's world, is around the concept of coordination. So let me walk through these each individually, and then I'll sort of expand on the coordination piece. So here's some questions for you to think about. The number one question is, do you have the talent, the teams, and the leadership capabilities you need to enable creativity, collaboration, problem solving, and motivation? The question then becomes, like, are you hiring for collaborative work, right? Are you hiring for people who have a problem solving mentality, meaning that they can actually push forward on playing to win as opposed to holding back because of the fact they don't want to lose, right? But problem solving is a critical thinking capability, and really understanding the concept around creativity, right? Oftentimes, if you're hiring people with the highest grades out of university, you got to question, are they the most creative people? Some creative people, don't necessarily make it through to the end of these, very designed programs that are, or they might actually have lower grades because they're more creative and less intentional about. So creativity, collaboration, problem solving, and motivation are really difficult in today's day because it depends on what you're innovating, right? So if you're innovating in my space, which is the digital space, I really have to be intentional about understanding and hiring for people that are really good at thinking about things differently, but also capable of putting action into deliberate mode, right? So this is almost a tension that exists between being creative and also being able to kind of get inside the weeds and being a bit more engineering-like or mechanical about how to get things done. So people is the number one thing on the priming the engine. Do you have the right people? Does your HR organization know how to hire the right people? So even in my space, we're still hiring IT project managers. And my question is why, right? Why are we not moving to organizations hiring product managers, and people really understanding the difference between product and project is critical in a digital innovation space. The second thing for priming the engine is around resources. And not only does it come down to budget, which I might argue again in the digital space, are you spending sufficient resources into getting a foundation of data in place before you want to kind of jump on the AI bandwagon, right? Are the resources available to you? But not only in money, but also talent, which we just talked about, but time, right? Everything's moving so fast. And so do you actually have time to innovate? Do you have the right tools to innovate? Are you embedding collaboration tools, for example, that help people really understand what everybody else is doing? So this is the concept of people and resources. And I think a lot of times people understand, and this is just thinking about these talent and resources a bit differently than maybe we did before. The process piece is an interesting one because, even call it 10, 15 years ago, many organizations invested significantly in Six Sigma, reprocessing their whole idea of getting the organization to run in a way that is very cross-functional, leveraging these enterprise resource planning system and putting everything into a process, right? We can get that by create a process for this or create a process for that. The whole concept around process is around repeatability and accountability. When you build a cross-functional process, it really gets down into routines, right? Methods of this is the way we do something. So I'm going to use the example of just a big toy retailer, right? When you think about getting down and dirty into the process, the process of the idea that the order's made online and then it goes into your warehouse and that people go and pick the order and then there's a process on how we get that order to the customer. This is all process-based. Now, there's an interesting thing about process when it comes to innovation, and that's the argument that process, although it might make innovative ideas happen, it can also take away innovative thinking. So it's like people stop, they allow the process to dictate their action as opposed to getting to think about what it is that they're doing. And so great story about a toy retailer where they put in a process around how people were going to pick orders and what boxes they were going to put them in, all around their strategy with regard to economic impact and the idea that they were trying to minimize waste. But what happened was the system would pump out and say, okay, this is the type of order box, the size of box you need to put an order in. And people just naturally, if they went against the system and they're saying, well, this little doll, I could put in this smaller box, but the system is actually going to reward people for putting it in the box that the system told them to put it in, not thinking about the facts that this doll could go in a smaller box because the system, the process is full loop, which meaning that it goes all the way back into the reward system. So this case, in fact, was having people in the warehouse using their brains to say, well, you know what, this doll could fit in this smaller box. But at the end of the month, the reward system came back and they had a metric to Elspeth's earlier point called box to order compliance, where if you put it in a different box using your mind, you would actually be, not rewarded or your incentives would go down, meaning that you're penalized for not adhering to the process as opposed to thinking about what it is that you're doing. So process to me is a really fun space. I'm doing a lot of work right now in insurance, right? Really around getting to the idea of how can we leverage process as a mechanism for innovation without, pulling out all of the innovative and the opportunity to think creatively. So this is a critical one, and I'll come back to it later in a second. The last one really comes down to coordination. And this comes down to the whole idea of, people and resources and processes all working together in a coordinated and responsive way. Now, the challenge is that once you prime it this way, once you get the coordination happening, you are able to adapt and fire continuously, which means that once everybody's operating in a coordinated way, we can act fast. Many of those things that Elspeth talked around culture, right? We can get faster, we can be more collaborative. But the problem is people are stuck in their silos, right? And so getting collaboration to happen can be extremely difficult. So the challenge is that people, resources, and processes are present. And I really do believe that the way that we've primed the engine for innovation is that people, resources, and processes are present, but uncoordinated, which means that they don't actually work together. So Elspeth, if you don't mind going on to the next slide. We talk about this in a great way in the Citibank's Innovation Lab. So in digital transformation, many organizations will put in a digital lab. And this is a great example of the idea that this is the way they were going to prime the system for digital innovation. So the labs operate in isolation from the lines of business, meaning that the lab was independent of the lines of business, meaning there's innovation happening over here, but not being embedded in the day-to-day action over here. Funding was episodic, meaning it was project-based and not programmatic, which means they got funding in certain funding cycles, but they didn't get funding. And you all know how that feels like when you're working in an environment where you're always questioning where your next round of funding is coming from. And then finally, there was no mechanism to integrate the prototypes into the regulated systems. So Citibank was creating all these great new digital tools, but there was no way to embed them into the regulated system. So the result was that they had a highly creative, low strategic yield impact, meaning that they were very creative, but they didn't actually deliver on the strategy. So the engine produced sparks, but did not sustain motion, which is the whole idea of the fact that it wasn't primed in a way that it could continue to drive results into the organization. So next slide, please, Elsa. So I'm giving you these 4 coordination musts. So if we focus on coordination, just a few things for you to take away. And I've given you some tools that you'll notice actually go back into Elspeth's tool, what Elspeth talked about. So there's integration between priming the engine and igniting the engine. So the first one is to make sure everyone understands how their work connects to the strategy. That's not that everything, they have to understand the strategy, but specifically what's in it for me. So Stephen Covey's 8th Habit book is probably one of the most important books I've read in the space around connecting work to strategy. And it really comes to say that if I don't understand what that strategy means to me as an employee anywhere, I'm really not going to do what I need to do to deliver results on that strategy. So that's the first part, is how much do people really understand how the day-to-day work that they do connects to the innovation thing, right? So what is this innovation? What does it mean for me? You must create flexibility to configure resources and talent. This means that we got to put talent and resources into play, but we also need to have flexibility with regard to how we move those resources around, or how we actually reconfigure talent, meaning are we going to put people in labs to learn from each other? But we really got to figure out not only to put the talent and the resources in place, but how to move them around in a flexible way to make sure the resources and talent are where they're needed at the right time. We must embed learning into workflow. So this goes back to my process argument before. Processes used to be linear, right? It used to be like the box to order compliance. The put it in this box, they put it in this box, and they send the box out. Elspeth talked earlier about metrics. The only way that that problem would be fixed is if the feedback came back into the system to be able to say, wow, you know, this person got their bonus taken away because they put the box in the wrong, size, or the order in the wrong box size. So who's not listening to the people in the warehouses? The feedback piece is critical. And I think if anything, we need to be focusing more on feedback, right? Critical feedback. And that needs to go up. So Elspeth and I are going to talk a little bit about hierarchy in a second. But I think the whole idea that I got to be able to tell my boss that this process isn't working. It's actually driving out the wrong behaviors. And so having psychological safety and the ability to provide feedback even up the organization is critical. And finally, pushing authority closer to where the knowledge and action resides is very, synonymous to the point I just talked about. But, making your governance a little bit less heavyweight and cascading decision rights to put decision rights in the hands of the people that are actually delivering the innovation to the people that are consuming the innovation. And that really makes us rethink the role of leadership in innovative companies, right? And the benefits we get from hierarchy versus trying to go into more peer-to-peer kind of leadership or situational leadership type models. All right, so the next slide for me, I think I've just got a couple more here, and then I wanted to talk briefly, and we got a message in the chat earlier about the whole concept of this is great, are you built to innovate? However, we also got to recognize all the forces that are disruptive right now, specifically with regard to generative AI, geopolitical instability, inflation, high interest rates. I think innovation's hard enough, let alone when the whole environment around us is changing. And so really so many things have to be in play to prime when you're dealing with chaos in the external environment. And so briefly, I just wanted to talk quickly about, next slide, please, Elspeth, just on looking at one thing specifically around, hey, how do we prime the engine with AI? As one example, like I also think we can prime the engine for, geopolitical turbulence. But priming the engine for AI really gets us to think about the idea that AI does not just optimize the engine for innovation. It totally reorganizes it, meaning that it takes intelligence and makes us really think about, okay, who is Kathryn plus AI, right? Plus AI plus Kathryn with my current skills equals what? How do I need to reorganize my job? How do I need to reorganize how many Kathryns you need in a company? But the whole idea that AI is changing people, AI is changing resources, meaning that you can, maybe use less people in this environment, but then when you actually amplify parts of your organization with AI, maybe you need more over in this side. It's also reorganizing processes and coordination. And so this is a whole other webinar where I would talk about priming the engine with AI. But I think the opportunity here is to think about, okay, when you think about task specialists and people, Gen AI enabled organization think about cognitive collaborators. So it's not only that I'm defined by my job as a task, but my job all of a sudden becomes I need to be a really intelligent collaborator with Elspeth. So her and I aren't like she's strategy, I'm digital technology, but we are now, continuously collaborating just like we are on this webinar in a heightened aspect of cognition, meaning we're smarter, we've got more access to innovation. By that measure, her and I should be able to do more in this new environment, working together than sitting in our old ways of this is her job, this is mine. So all of these become really critical ways to think about when you prime with AI, you're fundamentally changing the system. And so this is a way that we can kind of think about that through adaptive capabilities, generative learning, and what's called AI medicated alignment, which is really the idea that instead of what I talked about earlier, instead of my boss, and this is my boss, and this is my hierarchy, we come to this whole idea of saying, hey, you know what, boss, I have something to tell you. And that really is informed by this information that I have and this data, and it becomes much more collaborative and a feedback system where we start to see control elements within the organization being reorganized as well. So that's my overall on priming the engine in today's day of being built to innovate. And I think, Elspeth, we have a few questions in the chat, so I don't know where we want to go next, but I'll pass it back to her.
Okay, thank you so much, Kathryn, and thanks everyone. We have actually quite a long list of questions, so why don't we start with the first one? And the question is, with rapid advances, and Kathryn, you addressed some of this already, rapid advancements in AI and automation, how do you envision the future of creativity in the innovation process? And maybe I'll add one thing and then I'll toss it back to you, Kathryn. One of the processes that we spend a lot of time talking about is the weed and feed process. So how do you take the universe of possibilities and decide what to invest in? Because you can't invest in everything. So we've seen AI greatly accelerate that weeding and feeding process. simply because of the availability of information where you can look at a market or you can look at a specific technology and it's very easy to then make a call. It used to take you a long time to actually put a business case together. And now, you can automate a lot of that. So that weeding and feeding process has gone from like weeks and months down to a matter of days. So back to this VUCA environment and this ability to actually pick winners sooner rather than later and then work on them effectively. And so that's one thing. It's a game changer. And we're just really starting to see the game changer nature of that. And I guess one last comment, Kathryn, before I throw it back to you. You can sit on Chat GPT and you can say, come up with the 10 coolest ideas for a new sport. And it spits out some pretty wild and crazy stuff because, of course, it's just looking at everything that has been discussed historically. But certainly it can be that spark also to, oh, that's something that I can pursue. Let me work on that a little bit further. Kathryn.
Yeah, so I'll add a couple, and one of them, my first one goes directly with Elspeth. I think experimentation is critical, right?
Yeah.
So creating an opportunity for you to experiment with things. And so taking an idea and instead of saying, we're going to invest so much money in this project, but starting to just say, let's just do a simple experiment in one area of the business. Let's take 60 people, a good old pilot project, right? I think that's critical because now you can actually run through the opportunity to really make sure that there's a business value on the other end of that innovation cycle. But the other one I'll mention is I'm doing more and more work right now. So my whole area of expertise in my research side is in healthcare transformation. And in healthcare, we're doing a lot of simulation work. So we're leveraging, technology or really, I'm going to say data architectures. And we're starting to say, I wonder if we were to give this, responsibility to a nurse practitioner instead of a primary care doctor, how would that simulate itself in terms of creating innovative outcomes for the healthcare system? We can do all of that in a simulated environment. And that to me is where we start to see really exciting areas. But I will mention this, remember I talked about skills? I think one of the critical skills in doing that is research skills. Because we as PhDs, we learn that. We learn how to run simulations and create experimental environments, whereas a lot of organizations don't have that skill set. And so this is why, again, back to our programs, we're really starting to say innovation, if any before, has to be an academic. We bring academics to the table because we know how to do a lot of these things that are becoming more and more critical in the innovation processes that organizations live in today. So that's what I'd add to that question.
Okay. And it's so interesting because you talk about, a test and learn environment, and that's another way of accelerating. Should we do this? Yes or no? The collaborative tools, the no code tools now. So to get to like a prototype that you can do test and learn on, I mean, everything, the speed with which you can do all of those things is just sort of mind blowing. Okay, we've got time for a few more. So the next one is, I think this is really interesting. Do you typically see the work of priming the engine sitting within an innovation or strategy team? And then how do you think about the management of these systems and the role of a centralized function versus teams throughout the organization? So again, maybe Kathryn, I can start with that. This is, I think, a really great question because this is a mistake that organizations make. They create a C-suite position, the chief innovation officer. And Kathryn, you alluded to this a bit, right? Like us versus them. So where I've seen that work, and hopefully this answers the question, you need someone to oversee the entire system. You need to make sure that hiring practices are in sync. You need to make sure that the weeding and feeding process exists. You need to help keep an eye on culture. You need to look at whether the feedback loops and the processes are in place. Kathryn, back to the toy company, but you're not responsible for innovation. Everyone is responsible for innovation. So the lines of business, need to be completely involved in this. You might see as a chief innovation officer, the creation of a lab environment and all of those things. But this is the key, you don't actually have the organization power and influence to make it all happen. You are the great facilitator. And a lot of people will say, well, like we are focused on the day job. We want somebody else to focus on the new and nifty. And those days are long past. But that facilitator and that, heart, mind, and soul around innovation can work and can work really well. Kathryn.
Yeah, I think I'd add that like to me the where this sits is in strategy. There's no question to me. And this is why at Queen's we have a strategy execution program, which I would say has been operating for a lot of time when people didn't understand what it was. Because oftentimes we have strategy and then we're like, here we're going to create the vision of where we need to go. And then they lob ball it into the organization, say, okay, we need to get that done. Strategy execution is a fundamental organizational capability. And in my experience, I'm starting to see CEOs starting to put, chief strategy execution officers in play, but they really are managing the effectiveness of the organization to deliver on new and different, as well as keep the lights on, right? So that's a really challenging thing because gone are the days where we can just park innovation over here and let the day job run over here. But the integration between those two things requires, back to Elspeth's point, deliberate organizational design. And so that needs to be a very senior person. It can't be, delegated to some tactical person, but it's also very thoughtful in terms of how do we design for innovation? How do we build ourselves to be able to take that innovation and make it implant into the day-to-day work? And if you don't mind, Elspeth, I wanted to just pop into one part here. Jason asked a question about the fact that right now the focus has been on digital products and services. I might challenge that a little bit, Jason, specifically around the idea, like even in mining engineering, like over in our engineering, so much is being done in like a digital twin environment, right? So you're taking the mine and you're trying to put that into a virtual reality and you're innovating within a digital space. So we're not only talking about innovating digital products and services. My intent was to talk about how technology, data, AI is enabling innovation environments to fundamentally change. So I would say a lot of the things, even in heavy industries around mining, oil and gas, we're still twinning a lot of that capabilities in an innovation sector because it's so expensive and really, quite frankly, risky when we're doing a lot of innovation work in those heavy industries with real people and real money. We're trying to really find those synergies. So it wasn't my intent at all to talk about we're only talking digital innovation with regard to products and services that are digital. Our intent was to try to say how priming the engine in today's day is informed by technology, innovation, data, and that kind of thing. Elspeth's stuff, I think, floats either way, right? She was big industry, big tech, big industrial, she doesn't care, right? Whereas me, I think it's all about priming the engine with the data and the technology that we have available to us. So hopefully that clarifies things for Jason.
And I would just add on that question. I mean, and I've done a lot of work in the mining industry over many years, and I see mining companies get innovative when commodity prices are low. When the price of gold, if you're in the gold mining industry now and the price is sky high, it's like you just want to pump that stuff out and refine it and get it to market as quickly as you can. So price of gold goes down, price of copper goes down. Companies start to look internally about how you optimize processes and things like that. So I would tie that back to strategic intent. You're either committed to this stuff or you don't, or you're not. And if you fly in and then fly out of it, then what you do is you build all these innovation capabilities and then you get rid of them and then the commodity price is low again and you rebuild them. And so if you look at companies that are sustained innovators over many years, and yes, I would tie back to 3M. I would look increasingly, Google's been around for a while now. You see evidence where they have actually built that platform and they commit to it. And I wanted to go back to one other thing, Kathryn, that you said that got me thinking, and it's the relationship between like the truly big breakthrough ideas and how those get translated into practice. When you look at Google and how they built their new translation engine, okay, we're not quite at Star Trek yet, the universal translator, but not far off. It was in the labs, that's where the technological breakthrough happened. But don't forget, there was a person in charge of that line of business because there was already a translation engine. And so internally, part of their organizational platform were multiple opportunities for the people who were running the business and the idea creative types over here to connect. And so there's a great New York Times article actually on this point where it was the lab kind of inventor said, hey, I've got this cool thing that's so much better than we've currently got. You know, what do you think over here, business owner? And in a remarkable period of time, they funded and bought a bunch of, GPUs so that this new translation engine would work. And bingo, it was launched in a matter of months as opposed to years. So when we talk about the nuances around that organizational system, this is some of the stuff that we're talking about. Okay, there's some questions about the books we recommended. I know that's not a deep question, but Hit Reset is the story of Microsoft. Extraordinary story of how you focus on one or two things and you unlock innovation. So that's the Satya Nadella story. And I think, Kathryn, it was the Stephen Covey book.
Yep.
The one that you...
So the eighth habit was the book I mentioned.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Folks, I think that's all the time we have. I see so many questions that we haven't been able to get to, and I wish we had more time. But we hope that again, speaking of the priming of the pump here, we hope we've given you lots of things to think about. And so my role for the next couple of minutes is just to sort of wrap things up here. So first of all, Kathryn, always a pleasure to work with you and sort of have these discussions. It just like gets me thinking and really grateful for that. Kathryn had mentioned a couple of programs where we sort of cover innovation and execution. So let me just maybe give you a couple of things to think about on that front, and then we will wrap it up. So the strategic execution program is coming up, actually. I get to work with Kathryn again in the not too distant future. This is really going from, strategy to getting stuff done. We talk about innovation, we talk about KPIs, we talk about strategic intent, we talk about processes. One of the things I love about what Kathryn talks about is ventilating the silos. I sort of have that visual in my mind. So it's a terrific program and another QR code if you're interested in that. So we have 1 minute to spare. So on behalf of Kathryn and myself and the Smith School of Business, thank you so much for joining us today. And in this glorious post-Thanksgiving Tuesday, we hope it's been worth your time. Our next Smith Business Insight webinar is coming up next week. And that's really taking a hard look at how to accelerate your company's global growth. So keep an eye out in your inboxes for that. And enjoy the rest of your day. And thank you so much for joining us, and have a great rest of the week.
Thanks, everyone.